recap some of the things that he covered and some of the things he didn't cover as we go through today. So we're just going to bring a map up on the screen there. And if you have a look at that map there, that shows the Medo-Persian Empire at the time that this was recorded for. This is where the story came from, the time period. And that's a huge empire. That's going from India right across that Middle Eastern area down through Egypt to the border of Ethiopia. They were the powerhouse of government at the time. And what the king said was what the king said. If he made a decision, everyone was stuck by it, right across that whole region. And that's a huge area. If you think about the size of the Commonwealth, would probably fit inside that. So a huge area. Esther was written about 2,500 years ago, in 460 BC. It was before Ezra returned to Jerusalem, but it was before the fall of the Persian Empire to the Greeks. Xerxes, the king at the time, he's got several names. He has a Hebrew name and a Persian name. Today we're using the Hebrew name. He had a whole lot of power. And this power was horrendous. The author of Esther is unknown at this point, but we believe it to be a Jew who was living in the area at the time. And simply because of all their references to the Jewish customs and to the Jewish nationalism and the festival of Purim, which is a big highlight in the Jewish calendar. Now, one of the highlights last week was these feasts of King Xerxes. A feast that went for 180 days, where he entertained all his nobles and all his head people from throughout that district. So that's 6 months of partying. And it was then followed by a smaller feast of 7 days for all of the people of the city of Susa, from the lowest to the highest. And they drank out of these golden goblets. And they could drink as much as they liked, because it was on the king's tab. Imagine that sort of party. Imagine the debauchery that would happen when people lost control of their thinking. The other thing we learnt last week was the story of Queen Vashti and how she was deposed. So she lost her throne and her crown. All because the king could not control his anger and his thirst. A man who controlled that whole empire, and the two things he couldn't control, his anger and his thirst. And the reason she was deposed was because she dared to stand up to him when he summons to have a parade in front of all these nobles that were partying. And little known information is that at the time, she may have even been pregnant. So, knowing my wife, she did not want to be paraded around when she was pregnant. And imagine, being dragged out and told that's what you're going to be doing, all to please his vanity. One of the verses Craig didn't cover was that because she didn't do as she was told, the king's advisors told him to make a new law. And the law was that every man should be ruler over his household, his own household. And sometimes when people refer to the Bible and say the man is the head of the house and he's the king of the castle in his own home, that's kind of where it comes from. But if you compare it to what Paul said in Ephesians, you'll see what our beliefs are structured around, the way that we should look after our people in our family, particularly our wives, and how we should treat them. We also saw the introduction of Esther, who was a Jewish girl living with her cousin Mordecai at the time. She'd been brought up by Mordecai, and she was one of the ones that was, she's really the heroine of the story. And we're going to learn more about her as we go through the book. So this city of Susa, where it was set, it's one of the oldest cities in the world. It's part of a site that's still inhabited by the town of Shush in Iran. Excavations have uncovered evidence of continual habitation going back to 4,200 BC. And it's thought that even an earlier community was around before that. It's one of the hugest, largest excavation sites being investigated in the world at the moment. Most of it is still uncovered, even though they've been researching it for 150 years. In 2015, that town was given a status as a site of outstanding universal value by UNESCO. So if you were going to travel anywhere in the world and try and find the origins of mankind, you'd be getting pretty close if you went there. So let's have a look at Esther from chapter 2. We're going to jump in there at chapter 2. And we're going to read about what happened after the first round of parties. Now there was a time lag between this reading and the previous reading of about 5 years, when King Xerxes apparently went to try and conquer Greece, but he failed in his endeavours. So verse 19 says, when the virgins were assembled for a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had kept secret her family background and her nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to. For she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, they became angry and they conspired to assassinate the king. And Mordecai found out about this plot and he told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. When the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were hanged on the gallows. And all of this is recorded in the book of the Annals in the presence of the king. After these events, King Xerxes honoured Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and he elevated him and gave him a seat of honour higher than any of those other nobles that were there. All of the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honour to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down, and he would not pay him honour. The royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" And day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. And therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behaviour would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honour, he was enraged. And yet, having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. And historians tell us that's about 15 million people we're talking about. So his plan was to wipe them out. And remember, they are also in the lineage of Jesus. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, they cast the pur, or the Purim, in plural, in the presence of Haman to select a day and month. And the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed and scattered amongst the people in all the provinces of your kingdom, whose customs are different from all of those of the other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. It's not in the best interest of the king to tolerate them. And if it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them. And I will put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the men who carry out this business." So the king takes off his signet ring and he gives it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And he says, "Keep the money and do with the people as you please." And then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all of Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces and the nobles of the various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women, little children, on a single day. The 13th day of the 12th month, the day of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of this text or edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so that they would be ready for that day. Spurred on by the king's command, the couriers went out. The edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. Let's just consider what was going on then. Mordecai happens to overhear this plot to assassinate the king while he's sitting at the gate. Now, when we talk about a gate, we're not talking about a gate to your house. We're talking about it's almost like an official position in the court. And the gate entering into the walled palace complex was quite a large building, as you can see from the picture up there. And in this building, all the legal, the civil and the commercial business was transacted for the city. There's archaeological evidence from Susa that the gate was built by Xerxes' father and predecessor, Darius. And it was huge. It was about 131 feet by 92 feet. That's just the gate, or the court if you like. The central hall was supported by 4 big columns of trilingual inscriptions on the basis that read, Xerxes the king says, by the grace of Ahura Mazda, the gate, Darius the king made it, who was my father. The excavation of this gate and the square in front of it correspond well to the details of the palace given by the author of Esther through the story. So Mordecai foils this assassination plot by reporting it to Queen Esther, his cousin, who in turn reports it to the king Xerxes. And they give due credit to Mordecai. And all of this is recorded in the annals, the records of the king, for all time. Herodotus, who is an early historian of the church, he was born around about 440 BC, and he wrote a book called The Histories. And he's done a detailed inquiry of what was going on at that time in relation to the Greco-Persian wars. And it refers to this official list recorded in the Persian archives, naming the king's benefactors. Acts of loyalty were usually rewarded immediately and generously by the Persian kings. But Mordecai's reward was apparently overlooked. And although this attempt on Xerxes' life was foiled, the historian reports that a subsequent attempt did succeed and he was assassinated in 465 BCE. In today's reading, a new character is introduced to the story, and that's Haman, the Agagite. Xerxes has promoted Haman to a high position, though no explanation of why he deserved the honour is given. Given Mordecai's demonstrated loyalty to the king, promotion would have been an appropriate reward for him. And the author places the promotion of Haman just where the original readers would have expected to see a report on Mordecai's report. As a reward, he would be the benefactor. So Haman's introduction forms an unexpected twist in the story from Esther when compared to Mordecai's unrewarded loyalty. And amongst the stories, a sub-theme between Mordecai and Haman. And it's about respect commanded and respect refused. All of the officials at the king's gate knelt and paid honour to Haman because the king had commanded it. That is, except Mordecai. Mordecai refuses to give Haman the honour commanded by the king, and it's left unexplained. Perhaps he resented Haman's promotion when he himself deserved it. As many as 5 years has passed, and if it was Mordecai's reason for not bowing to Haman, it was apparently not obvious to his colleagues. They asked him repeatedly to explain himself, and still he refused. And the text doesn't say he refused to pay homage because he was a Jew, although that is implied. His colleagues reported his behaviour to Haman to see if Mordecai the Jew would be given an exception to the king's command. And all of this suggests a lurking tension between the Jews and the Gentiles at that time. Interpreters through the ages have offered explanations for Mordecai's refusal. It's known from other sources that the Jews did bow to pagan officials of the Persian court. But it wasn't a religious act. It was one of court protocol, such as someone doing a curtsy to the Queen, or in court today bowing to a judge entering and leaving the court. This suggests that Mordecai's refusal was not religiously motivated, but personal and specific to Haman. In the Greek version of the story, Haman, Mordecai explicitly says that it is not from egotism or arrogance that he refused to bow to Haman, but that he might not give glory due to God to any man. Some others have suggested that Haman had some sort of emblem on his coat, which was a pagan emblem, and Mordecai didn't want to bow to that. When the Hebrews were writing stories in their narratives, the characteristic described when a character is introduced to the story is key to understanding his or her role in the story. When Mordecai is introduced in chapter 2, verse 5, he's identified not as a wise man or as an official in a court, but as a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin. When Haman is introduced, he's identified as an Agagite. And the author is implying that the hostility between the Jews and the Agagites is mirrored in the personal relationship between Mordecai and Haman. And the original readers of the story would have expected to be some sort of conflict and aggression between the two because of it. If we go back a bit further, Agar was the king of the Amalekites, at the time of Saul, who was also from the tribe of Benjamin. And he was the first king of Israel. The Amalekites were a nomadic people from the southern desert who frequently raided Israel from the beginning of its history. The heathen nation had the dubious distinction of being the first people of the world to attack and try and destroy God's newly formed covenanted nation. Because of this, God promised Moses that he would completely erase the memory of the Amalekites from under heaven, and they would be at war with them from generation to generation. We flick back in the Bible and history to Deuteronomy 25. It says, "Remember what the Amalekites did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt. When you were weary and worn out, they met you on your journey and they cut off all those who were lagging behind. They had no fear of God. When the Lord your God gives you rest from all your enemies around you in the land he has given you to possess as an inheritance, you will blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven, and do not forget." So in the years between Moses and King Saul, God gave Israel the land as promised. And when Saul came to power, God instructed him through Samuel to attack the Amalekites. In 1 Samuel, it says, "Samuel said to Saul, 'I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. So listen now to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came from Egypt. Now go attack the Amalekites, totally destroy everything that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men, women, children, infants, cattle, sheep, camels, and donkeys.' Now Saul did attack the Amalekites as commanded, but then he took Agar, their king, alive and spared his life along with the best of his sheep and cattle, in direct disobedience to God's command. And over the centuries after that, Saul had spared Agar's life, other reoccurring enemies of Israel were called Agagites, even though they had no ethnic relationship to the original Amalekites. In the first century of this era, for example, Jewish writers referred to the Romans as Agagites. In our own time, the Palestinians in Israel are sometimes referred to their ancient title. Esther had been queen for 5 years when Haman skillfully manipulates the king to gain support for his evil plan. He begins by bringing an accusation certain to arouse the king's attention. He says, "These are certain people who do not obey the king's laws." And it may have been true that the Jews observed certain distinctive customs even in Persia. But in the story fact, it is only Mordecai who does not obey the king. And then only one specific command, and that was to bow to Haman. Haman carefully avoids mentioning that these people are the Jews. And the king is apparently too apathetic to ask which people are so charged. Haman then appeals to the king's need to replenish the treasury, depleted by his disastrous war with Greece. Herodotus, the historian, reports that the annual revenue of the Persian Empire under Xerxes' father Darius was 4,500 talents. So this revenue was generated by gathering tribute or taxes from the satraps. Haman's offer to replace 10,000 talents of silver, it's about 300 tons of silver, represents a substantial contribution to the coffers of the king. Now, Haman may have thrown out this exaggerated amount, but presumably any amount that he did promise, he would be taking from the plunders and the possessions of all the Jews that they were going to kill. Here's a wee slide showing how much that silver's worth today. 300 tonnes of silver, and that's conservative price, $15 an ounce. He's offering the king $144 million. So he wasn't just an ordinary guy. He obviously had means and access to means, but of course most of that money he was hoping would come from the Jews that he was going to wipe out. Haman, like others before him, informs the king what is in the king's best interests. And Xerxes, whose word is irrevocable law, was first advised by Memucan in chapter 1 on how to deal with Vashti. So it continues. The personal attendants suggested how the queen would be chosen, and in both previous cases, the machinery of this entire empire has been put into motion by the advisor's manipulation of the king. And in this scene also, the king just blindly allows Haman to use the royal power to his own means. And this signet ring, we'll put a picture up of a signet ring that may have been something like this one that's up on the board at the moment. It was used to sign all the official documents and to seal orders. And that was given to Haman. So he could use that. He was vested with the full authority of the throne to do what he wished. Whoever possessed the signet ring would effectively hold the king's authority in all matters. Now Haman was into a little bit of the black magic, if you like, and he needed to determine the most favourable time for attack on the Jews, because a lot of planning is needed if you're going to try and wipe out 15 million people on one day throughout a whole region. So Haman consults the pur or the lot, and the plural of that word is Purim. Archaeologists have unearthed samples of these Purim, which were clay cubes, and they're inscribed with these the cuneiform characters or with dots that look very similar to a modern dice. So casting the lot literally meant throwing the dice. But unlike their modern use, the ancient lot was used not for gambling, but for divination. And it was a way of asking the gods for the answers to questions about the future. The word Purim in the Hebrew word is an Akkadian word, and it's only found in the book of Esther, although its other translations are used elsewhere. The Israelites at one stage also drew lots, didn't they? For instance, Joshua cast lots before the Lord to learn how to assign the land to various tribes. So it was something that was common throughout the world. Haman cast the lot in the first month, which is Nisan, the month the Jews celebrated the Passover. And how ironic it is that we celebrate communion this morning. You know, in Easter time when Jesus celebrated the first Passover with his disciples before he died, that was Nisan 14. So he's casting lots and making the decree on the night of the Passover to wipe out the Jewish nation. And then immediately he sends out those dispatches, maybe they were Pony Express or something like that, but the messages went out to the whole kingdom, if you like. The decree orders the citizens of Persia to take up arms against their Jewish neighbours. They are to kill the young, the old, the women, the children, and that would take place exactly 11 months later on the 13th day of the 12th month. So Passover celebrates the deliverance of Israel from Egypt, and that event constituted the founding of God's covenant nation of Israel. It celebrates the existence of the Jews as people and their special relationship with God. The joy of this holiday is slowly turned to sorrow in Persia when the decree is delivered on Passover. It calls for the annihilation simply because they are Jews. And in modern history today, we've seen parallels to that, haven't we? The coincidence of the decree with the Passover is tragically ironic, but it serves to heighten the glory of the subsequent deliverance and links it to the ancient covenant of Sinai. When he was first introduced in chapter 3, verse 1, Haman is referred to as the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. But when it's repeated in verse 10, it adds the additional phrase, enemy of the Jews. And in this chilling scene, all of the power of the Persian Empire is about to come down on the Jewish people because of Haman's overriding pride. Haman's prideful demand of Mordecai's respect and Mordecai's refusal to give it hastens the threat of genocide. Notice that the king had to command his lowly officials to pay honour and respect to Haman. He didn't have a mantle of authority on his own. He wasn't recognised as a leader, but he's been put in this position and he's been given this power. And everyone else has been told to respect him. It's another example of how the power of the empire was used to demand respect. Just as Memucan in chapter 1, he talked about giving honour and respect to the king, and that wives were to respect their husbands. Memucan's similar fear of losing respect drove him to escalate an incident between Xerxes and Vashti to an empire-wide proportion through the issuing of a royal decree. The disobedience of one woman, Vashti, had reverberations for all women in the empire. And a similar pattern is seen in this episode, where an incident involving two individuals escalates into an empire-wide proportion. The disobedience of one Jew, Mordecai, brings an edict against all Jews of the empire. And the sub-theme of Esther's story is that when such maniacal need for honour and respect is coupled with absolute power, the result is oppression and injustice. In Jeremiah it says, "You are always righteous, O Lord, when I bring a case before you. I would speak with you about your justice. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why do all the faithless live at ease?" This question no doubt crosses Mordecai's mind when Haman the Agagite is promoted to live in the power and wealth of being second only to the king himself. In those times, the custom was that the Persian kings would liberally reward their benefactors. Mordecai's unrewarded good deed, which saved the king's life, was an injustice. In the circumstances of Mordecai the Jew, one of God's people, and Haman the Agagite, an enemy of God, surely gives rise to the question so eloquently expressed in Jeremiah 12. Esther became queen in the 7th year of Xerxes' reign, and Haman conspires against the Jews in the 12th year. Sometime within this 12-year period, Mordecai foiled the assassination plot, and Haman rose to power. And while Mordecai went unrewarded for quite some time, the man who would eventually attempt to eliminate the Jews was rising to a position in the court where he had the power to actually make good on such a threat. But had Mordecai been rewarded immediately, as was the custom, maybe there wouldn't have been an opportunity for such reward in saving the Jews by the end of the story. Haman has risen to this position of power, but both Esther and Mordecai are now also in a position to be agents of the later deliverance of their people. But of course they cannot see what's ahead. Both Esther and Mordecai have come to this place through injustice and wickedness of others. And even so, they've both made decisions to live as they did in the Persian court. And these unfolding events begin to show the interplay between circumstances thrust upon us, sometimes unjustly, and those the result of our own behaviour, often flawed. God's providence thankfully moves through both in his good time. In Proverbs 16 it also refers to the lot. It says the lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord. Haman cast the lot to secure a date for the successful annihilation of the Jews. But it was Yahweh, the God of the Jews, who determined how it fell. Even the date of the planned annihilation of God's people was determined by Haman's gods or by chance. It was actually determined by God. God knew where those dice were going to fall. According to the ancient covenant he made with Israel when he brought them out of Egypt. At Exodus, commemorated by the Passover, God saved his people from destruction by the Amalekites. and promised to do so from generation to generation. So history has shown that there is a force at work in the world bent on destroying God's people and thwarting God's promises. It can unleash the power of the world's greatest and mightiest nations by using the depraved nature of those entrusted with power. And we look around world politics today, we see some people that we just shudder. Why is that person in that position? This episode from Esther shows the security of God's people is fragile as they live under worldly rulers. Because of an impersonal conflict between two individuals, the existence of the whole nation of God's people is jeopardised. The world is shown to be a dangerous place, a place where it is not in the king's best interest to tolerate the people of God. A similar situation to the story in Susa occurred in the life of the early church when the first century Christians felt the full force of the Roman Empire. The Roman emperors demanded respect by issuing a decree that an offering of incense must be burnt in their honour. And all good citizens of the empire would in this way express their appreciation for the benefits of and the well-being that the Roman emperor was providing them. When Christians saw that demand to be in conflict with their allegiance to Jesus Christ and refused to pay such honour, the charge brought against them was treason, a political crime punishable by death. And it was not in the best interest of the empire to let these traitors live, though their only offence was refusal to offer the respect that they demanded. If you read through Revelation, there's similar stories about what happens when people don't yield to worldly authorities. In Revelation 13 it says, "The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise his authority for 42 months. He was given this power to make war against the saints and to conquer them. He was given authority over every tribe, people, nation and language. Satan the dragon drives the beast of the world empires to demand respect, to destroy those who refuse it. When he was in the desert, Jesus himself endured Satan's demand to be worshipped. In Luke 4 it says that Satan displayed all the kingdoms of the world. And he said to Jesus, "I'll give you all authority and splendour, for it has been given me, and I can give it to anyone I want. So if you worship me, it'll be yours." But Jesus replied, "It is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Jesus refused to bow down to Satan. And consequently the worldly powers of the Jewish aristocracy, they consorted with the Roman Empire, and that was eventually turned against him and he was crucified. An assault on God's covenant people at any time in human history is really an attack on authority, power and the character of God himself. Although neither God nor Satan is mentioned in the book of Esther, there is a force at work directing the mighty power of the Persians against God's people. It's a force that demands to be respected and honoured, a force that is willing to destroy those who refuse. However, an even greater power is currently at work protecting, preserving and saving the Jews from destruction. Both the power that would destroy and the greater power that would deliver them from destruction are veiled in the actions of Haman and Xerxes, Mordecai and Esther. Satan's rebellion against God and his people was played out in the lives of people whose individual decisions have far-reaching consequences, right down to us today. Although Mordecai did not refuse to pay homage to Haman for religious reasons in Esther's story, he stands on the side of those who will refuse to bow to the beast and who, as a result, suffer the crushing force of earthly powers driven by Satan. So let's consider what this means for us today. What's in it for us? It's a great story, but it's really a story of it's the history of how Esther is used to save the Jewish nation. But for us today, when we read the scriptures, you've probably got some questions. Sometimes when things go wrong in our lives, we say, where is God? He's not mentioned in the book of Esther at all. Like Mordecai, where is God when you feel undervalued or overlooked? Where is God when you get stuck with a boss that you have little respect for? Where is God when our plans don't work out or disaster strikes? Whether we like it or not, we're often caught in circumstances beyond our control. Life is full of seemingly insignificant events that in hindsight we recognise as changing the course of our lives. Every new day brings circumstances and decisions, and we cannot know how one event will lead to another. Only God knows the end before it has even begun. The author of Esther is demonstrating the workings of a divine providence. God works mysteriously, patiently, and inevitably through a series of coincidental events and human decisions, even those based on questionable motives and evil intents. All of the chance events in life are really working toward the end that God has already ordained for us. Esther suffers this humiliation of being taken into the king's court to be sexually exploited. No one considered what plans she might have for her life, plans to perhaps become a godly wife with a home, her own family. Her plans for life were forever changed when the king's men seized her from her home for that beauty pageant. Mordecai suffered the humiliation of being deprived of his rightful reward after putting himself at risk to save the king's life when he reported the treacherous officials. To add insult to injury, Haman was all the while gaining power that would eventually be turned against Mordecai and his people. There's a sad irony in it that when the wicked do prosper, God's people are often overlooked and unrewarded. It's frustrating when our best plans are overturned and our good deeds and our hard work go unnoticed and unrewarded. We can often see others prospering who are less deserving, at least in our own opinion anyway. Such injustice hurts, but the example of Esther and Mordecai gives us reason to bear such situations with patience and grace. Mordecai's patience and self-control when he did not receive the expected reward allowed that injustice to lead to a greater good when it was finally put right. God is invisibly at work. He was invisibly at work in their lives and in ours today. We cannot see the end of things from the middle, and sometimes we have to walk by faith, not by sight. The Lord will bring a greater good, his perfect plan, out of the frustration that we all feel, out of all the evil that we experience from time to time. When all is said and done, God uses even injustice to fulfill his promises to us. Just as Joseph explained to his brothers, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. God's absolute sovereignty is displayed in this great paradox that even Satan's wrath and his retribution working through worldly powers is nevertheless it's constrained by God's eternal decrees. God's working, he works concurrently through the very forces that Satan means for evil to bring about his good, perfect will. And it's with this confidence that the early church prayed for the boldness to preach the gospel while facing life-threatening opposition. And with the same confidence, Christians today can face the powers of the evil arraigned against them. In Romans 8:28 it says, God intends to save and protect his people in Christ and ultimately to destroy those who wickedly remain opposed to Christ. And through the story of Esther we see that there is no power, no enemy, no thing that can thwart God's electing purposes. I'm going to finish today by reading from Psalm 16, verses 1 to 11. It says, and this could be a prayer as well, keep me safe, O Lord, for you and you I take refuge. I said to the Lord, you are my Lord. Apart from you, I have no good thing. As for the saints who are in the land, they are glorious ones in whom all is my delight. The sorrows of those will increase who run after other gods. I will pour out their libations of blood, or take up their names on my lips. Lord, you have assigned me my portion and my cup. You have made my lot secure. The boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Surely I have a delightful inheritance. I will praise the Lord, who counsels me even at night. My heart instructs me. I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand. I will not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad and my tongue rejoices. My body also will rest secure. Because you will not abandon me to the grave, nor will you let your Holy One see decay. You have made known to me the path of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence and with eternal pleasures at your right hand. We're encouraged by Esther and Mordecai's stand against the unholy nature of Haman and his cronies, and even indeed King Xerxes' apathy towards looking after the people of his kingdom. The story has a theme of honour, those with honour and those without honour, and God will reward those with honour, those that stick to his decrees, not the king's. So thank you for your time. We're going to get the team up to sing a couple of songs and